I went to over 100 funerals in a 3-year period, and I think 2 of them were natural causes. There was a couple suicides, a few homicides, and the rest of them were drug poisonings. So, I realized that what we were doing was failing miserably.
I'm Olivia Weeks, a reporter for the Daily Yonder, and this is the 5th and final episode of Home Cooked, a 50-year history of meth in America. The voice you just heard is David Stoker, a former meth user and current addiction treatment counselor in Springfield, Missouri. He's talking about the failures of traditional approaches to treating substance use disorder.
I should have known it anyway, because every time I went to treatment, what they would tell me is 9 out of 10 of you aren't going to make it. Like, they were bragging about it. Like, you're bragging that your industry is 10% effective. If it was anything else, would you take your car to a shop that was like, there's a 90% chance your brakes won't work after we fix them? A lot of times, even great programs, you're going to see 40 to 60% success rate. We measure it by abstinence instead of quality of life. And I think that's been part of the shift, is realizing that if I have somebody that's using drugs that's unhoused and doesn't have a job and, has no contact with their families, and I'm able to work with them, and now they live in housing, they're employed, they've recreated those bridges with their family, but they're still using, that's a huge success.
This is David's rationale for adopting harm reduction rather than abstinence-only goals in addiction treatment. Harm reduction encourages incremental improvements in quality of life, while abstinence-based treatment can sometimes alienate people who aren't able to quit drugs all at once, but are actively improving their relationships with addictive substances. David told me about something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which lists 10 categories of trauma and asks the user to check a box for each one they experienced before the age of 18. On one online version of the survey, the first question asks, "Did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect or take care of you?" Others ask whether you experienced parental divorce, addiction, or incarceration. The number of boxes you check is your score.
Like, I score a 9 on it. But what they found out was if somebody scores a 4, they're more likely to have an alcohol use disorder, more likely to attempt suicide. If somebody scores a 6, they're more likely to inject illicit drugs, and their life expectancy is shorter than somebody who scores a 0. Most people were treating the solution, not the problem, if that makes sense. Like, I didn't have a drug problem. I had a trauma problem and a drug solution, because I was never taught coping skills, attachment skills, a lot of those things. And I quickly found another alternative.
David's testimony here hits on a lot of the major themes and conversations I've had about the current synthetic drug crisis. First of all, his unenviable funeral attendance record speaks to the previously unheard of overdose death rate in America. In 2021, more than 106,000 people died from drug overdose. That's roughly the population of Green Bay, Wisconsin. It's a big country, so I think feeling the outsized weight of that number can be difficult. But for another reference, more than 5 times as many people died from drug poisoning in 2021 as in 1999. Second, David addresses the movement of harm reduction into the mainstream, as more traditional forms of deterrence and treatment have so clearly failed to meaningfully address the growing problem. And third, in his point about adverse childhood experiences, he acknowledges the necessity of more structural solutions to addiction. If trauma is the problem at the heart of addiction, rather than the mere existence of addictive drugs, then trauma is the problem that must be solved. Addressing trauma would require deep societal shifts, not just a new medication-assisted treatment, or a new strategy for removing drugs from the streets. Throughout this series, we've been focused on meth's past. I've spoken with a lot of people who've either studied, policed, or participated in illegal meth markets. They've helped us see how the drug once existed within its own weird, hyper-local economies, and had profound material and cultural effects, especially on rural America. They've also helped us understand the present moment, in which meth supply chains are vast, international, and seemingly unstoppable. I hope that listeners have come to see through the layers of stereotypes and sensationalist media narratives that have built up around meth since it was effectively outlawed in the early 70s. I also hope the series has clarified the real, material problems posed by the concurrent expansions in the meth and fentanyl supplies. This episode is going to feature plenty more discussion of those problems, but it's also going to circle around one big, possibly unanswerable question. What can be done? Also, this episode includes some worse than usual sound quality from phone conversations I had. I hope you'll bear with us, because I'd really like listeners to hear from the people featured here. Jeff Pulcher works for the Rural AIDS Action Network. He's based in a small town in Minnesota's Iron Range, which is a rural mining region in the northeast of the state. Pulcher says that, like the rest of the country, Minnesota has seen the drug supplies of its rural and urban areas grow more similar over time. He compared his office in Hibbing, Minnesota, to a bigger office in Duluth.
Opioids were always big down there. They were much bigger than meth. It was just the opposite here. If it was 60-40 opioids to meth in Duluth, it would be the opposite up here. Meth has always been king, so to speak, on the range. But things have changed dramatically in the last couple of years. Fentanyl has been a game changer. It used to be only opiates. They cut Percocet with it, Oxy, Hydros, whatever. But now we're seeing more and more meth that's been cut with fentanyl. It's just terrible. People are taking meth and dying of an overdose of opiates. It's that scary. Hence why we made such a huge push in all of Minnesota to distribute as much Narcan that we can, trying to prevent some of these overdoses.
Tim Rubel, a former meth user who'd been in recovery for a little over a year when we spoke, told me that the same thing happened in his larger hometown of Springfield, Missouri.
Where I'm from, there wasn't hardly any heroin or fentanyl out there. And then over a little period of time, it just seemed like it just blew up in Springfield. People that use meth really didn't use that at all. And then it kind of mixed and mingled. A lot of people went from meth to trying fentanyl, and that drug is just a monster as far as addiction. People would get so hooked on it that they didn't care about the other drug, I guess.
Both of those accounts track with what Captain Chris Jones, director of the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention, said. That meth was newly present in drug markets where it had previously been unpopular.
One of the things we saw in the treatment data is that in the Northeast, where historically you had more of a cocaine-based market, we saw large relative increases in treatment admissions where people were reporting methamphetamine use. That was consistent with DEA data showing that over that same time period, there was this influx of methamphetamine into the Northeast. But we saw increases really everywhere.
Across the board, drug markets got less geographically specific over the course of the 2010s. That's because of the trends we've discussed throughout this series. The successive rounds of crackdowns on domestic meth markets incentivize innovations abroad, and particularly in Mexico. The easy accessibility of synthetic opioids and stimulants has created a diffuse national drug market. Individual cities are less likely to be dominated by opioids or meth. A lot of places are now facing a more generic synthetic drug crisis. From 2018 to 2020, the National Rural Opioid Initiative conducted a 10-state study of rural people who use drugs. They found that 63% of participants who reported use of either meth or opioids reported use of both meth and opioids. 24% of participants reported only using opioids, while 13% reported only using meth. So the concurrent use of meth and opioids is a huge problem, and, at least in the rural areas in this study, it seems to be the dominant drug problem of the present moment. This is scary because, unlike for opioid use disorder, there are no proven medication-assisted treatment options for stimulant use disorder, the category meth addiction falls under. Captain Jones told me that, partially because of that, people with co-occurring stimulant and opioid use disorders are much more difficult to treat.
We also see, again, this connection between co-use of opioids and stimulants. And there was research that came out a few years ago that really showed that people who are using both tend to have suboptimal treatment outcomes. So even if you could prescribe buprenorphine or provide methadone or extended release naltrexone for the treatment of opioid use disorder, if you didn't also address co-occurring conditions like stimulant use disorder, people were not likely to achieve optimal outcomes with their medication.
So this is the new landscape of addiction in America. A lot of people are hooked on really strong synthetic drugs, and a lot of people are dying from them. Concurrent meth use makes opioid use disorder harder to treat, and concurrent opioid use makes meth addiction more deadly. So what's the cause of this failure? The many problems with the current US approach to drug control are well documented, and too various to name here. But a few presented themselves really clearly over the course of my interviews and research for this series. Meth's history shows us that when the federal government tries to limit illegal drug use, it often backfires. One concept I've already mentioned that I think is helpful for understanding that trend is called the profit paradox. It's from a 1996 book called Drug War Politics: The Price of Denial. And it basically says that it's really difficult to stamp out black markets because as illegal drugs become harder to get, they also become more expensive, which incentivizes illicit actors to figure out how to supply them. This happened after meth was criminalized, when biker gangs, and then small-scale cooks, and then finally, Mexican drug traffickers stepped into successive supply vacuums to meet American demand for meth. The consequences of that process playing out are larger than just the continuous supply of drugs. Another useful concept, one I haven't mentioned yet, is called the iron law of prohibition. To explain this, I'm going to summarize an article in the International Journal of Drug Policy. It's called Today's Fentanyl Crisis: Prohibition's Iron Law Revisited. That paper, I think really brilliantly, begins by quoting the aphorism, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." The authors write that, quote, "Imposing substantial barriers and costs to the illicit drug supply chain creates direct pressure to minimize volume while maximizing profit," end quote. Because illegal drugs have to be created and delivered in secrecy, small volumes are more convenient than big ones. This means that strong drugs are better than weaker ones, even if the user's experience of weaker drugs is a better one. In the Prohibition era, if you could only smuggle one bottle of alcohol and you wanted a few people to get drunk, you'd opt for a bottle of whiskey over a bottle of beer. The same thing applies today. Fentanyl is so much stronger than heroin that you can make a lot more money on a coffee can of fentanyl in a shipping container than you can on a coffee can full of heroin. In this way, policing illicit drugs incentivizes low-volume, high-potency products. It's no coincidence that the synthetic drugs so common in the US today fit that description. Another example of drug war failure is mass incarceration. In large part due to its commitment to drug policing, the US is responsible for 16% of the world's prison inmates. That's 4 times its share by population. Over 1 million drug-related arrests take place per year, and nearly a quarter of those arrested are sentenced to prison for their crimes. One problem with incarcerating countless nonviolent drug offenders is that it hasn't seemed to ameliorate the top-level problems of addiction and overdose. But another problem is that it doesn't work on a smaller scale either. For many people, prison has been a setting for continued or worsening addiction. Tim Rubel mentioned that.
I mean, you can get pretty much everything in prison that you can get on the streets besides a gun. People were getting needles to shoot up with in prison, different kinds of drugs in there. I mean, just prison was just like the streets, just we were confined behind a fence.
Chris Jones, a harm reductionist and former meth user working in Arkansas, who happens to share a name with Captain Chris Jones, who we heard from earlier in this episode, told me another failure of drug policing is that cops have so much access to people in the throes of addiction, and yet they rarely use that access for good.
I'm also a huge advocate to work with law enforcement because I think that most people don't know that they have a problem until a cop or a judge tells them that they have a problem. And so I think a cop with resources is a huge game changer. I've sat in the back of a cop car probably 40 times. Not once did they ever give me a phone number and say, when you get out, you should call him. He may be able to help. They always said, I'll catch you next time. They always said, you're never going to learn. Not one of them officers ever said, I want to see you do better. Here's a resource. And so I go out of my way to work with law enforcement to try to be that resource. It's something we can do that we haven't tried.
As I mentioned earlier in this episode, alternatives to traditional drug war policing have gotten more popular. Harm reductionists nationwide have fought for accessible clean needle exchanges, fentanyl test strips, and naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug. These are crucial resources for people who use drugs and hope to do so safely. Chris Jones, the Chris Jones who works for Northwest Arkansas Harm Reduction, described his work this way.
Whenever I say harm reduction, there's a couple different types of people. One says, you guys give out free Narcan. The other one says, you guys give out free syringes. But in all reality, what we do is we provide anything that's going to keep somebody safe from any risky behaviors. There are some organizations that target just opiates and fentanyl overdose. But what we try to do is keep anyone safe in whatever it is that they're doing, and then provide them with resources for recovery when they're ready. It's going to sound kind of bad, but I tell people, like, if you'll call me for a clean rig, you'll call me for a bed and detox. I have both. A lot of the people I meet through harm reduction, they just want that compassionate, non-judgmental voice on the other end of the phone that's not going to tell them how horrible of a person they are for wanting to not die. There's one person on the other end of the phone that says, I care and I don't want you to die. Let me exchange that dirty syringe for a clean one. That's one person that they don't want to disappoint, and that may be what it takes for them to turn to recovery. And so I use the harm reduction organization kind of as a stepping stone to meet the people that I want to work with. It may take years, right? It's not my call. I may meet the same person for several years for clean use items, but there's a chance at some point they want recovery and they already know me.
The fact that someone might, as Chris mentions, spend years accessing harm reduction services before seeking treatment is, I think, the beautiful thing about the philosophy. And a reason some people have a hard time swallowing it. Harm reduction offers unconditional acceptance of individuals who use drugs, always offering a bridge back from addiction no matter how many times a person has chosen not to take it. I think one of the most understandable reasons that approach rubs people the wrong way is that if our overdose and addiction rates are so extraordinarily high, it's difficult to imagine how such an approach could get us closer to solving it. Jeff Pulcher from the Rural AIDS Action Network, who we heard from earlier, like Chris Jones, described a circular pattern to addiction and recovery. He told me he often sees people begin in recovery and relapse several times before they're able to find an equilibrium.
We take a whole different approach to what we consider a success. We've always had that ongoing conversation about, it's okay to slip, it's okay to slide, but what can we do to get you back on track?
But that success, according to Pulcher, requires a lot of patience.
So much more focus now is just on keeping people alive.
Keeping people alive is a necessary mission, but it's not a structural or long-term solution. One idea that might serve as the harm reductionist's broader goal is the decriminalization of psychoactive drugs. Famously, the state of Oregon is currently debating that issue. In November of 2020, Oregon residents voted decisively in favor of a ballot measure decriminalizing the possession of personal amounts of illegal drugs. The idea was that if incarceration is a counterproductive and expensive response to addiction, state resources should be directed toward treatment instead. That approach has worked well outside of the US, notably in Portugal, where the police try to get people into addiction treatment rather than jail. But on the 1st of April 2024, Oregon Governor Tina Kotek signed a bill into law, once again making drug possession a misdemeanor crime. Oregon voters and politicians have turned away from decriminalization in a context of rising homelessness and overdose death rates. But advocates for the ballot measure point out that Oregon's addiction and overdose statistics are no worse than the numbers regionally or nationally. The state of Washington, where drug possession is still illegal, saw its fatal overdose rates rise even faster than Oregon's. There are serious problems with decriminalization. Without full legalization of psychoactive substances, users must still turn to the unregulated black market for their supplies. As we've been discussing throughout this episode, that supply is unprecedentedly dangerous at the moment. Another problem with Oregon's strategy, which a lot of media coverage of the policy paints as particularly damning, is that few people are using all of the resources at their disposal to try and get clean. As part of the decriminalization program, the state set up a hotline for people to call to access treatment resources. Over the 3 years it's existed, its use has been sparse. It's not difficult to understand why. One thing that people across the ideological spectrum agree upon is that you can't make someone want to get sober. It's often a frustratingly circular process. Cherie Beebe, a peer recovery specialist in Joplin, Missouri, told me it took several run-ins with the law and failed attempts at sobriety for her to make progress.
I mean, I've been to prison, I've been homeless, I've lost my kids, I've got my kids back. I've tried a few times to quit, going into, inpatient somewhere, and nothing really seemed to work till my last go around.
What do you think was different about the last time?
I caught it was like my fourth felony, and they were trying to give me prior and persistent, and then they offered me treatment court or drug court, and I went ahead and took that, and I just knew I'd have that accountability, and I was not wanting to go back to prison, and I was just tired of being tired. I have 7 kids, and they need me.
What was it like trying to get sober the first few times when it didn't take?
So the first couple times that I had to get sober, I had to because I lost my kids. So it was easy at the moment, but I didn't change my people, places, and things. When I got out, I just went straight back to the situation or the house or environment that I was in and associated with the same people. So, and I didn't work a recovery. So that's most likely why I went back to using. I knew that I had to do stuff that I didn't do before because none of that worked before, and change my people, places, and things, and listen to what people say that have multiple years of sobriety, what works for them, and do that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the people, places, and things thing sounds really hard. Like, you say it really simply, like, that's just what you gotta do. But, that's like your whole life.
I guess I say it so easy because it's like
It's a mantra.
yeah, it's like you have to.
I guess recovery sort of provides a community
Yes.
in that way. But was it lonely?
With me, it wasn't because I have 7 kids and
Hard to be
all my
lonely.
kids live with me. But but it was lonely in the sense of, some people go through where they're in a relationship and they're trying to get clean and their partner's not. And that's, for instance, my situation when I first started getting clean was my partner was still using, and staying with that partner that was using because their attention's focused elsewhere. I ended up relapsing because I wanted his attention, and of course wasn't worth it because then I had consequences behind it, and so I had to get rid of him. And then you learn to be comfortable being alone, and then you're supposed to go to meetings and get numbers and be with like-minded people, and eventually you just surround yourself with those type of people.
Cherie's story shows how difficult and nonlinear the process of getting sober can be. It's often the case that, in addition to ending a chemical dependence on drugs, people who are trying to get clean have to change their entire lives. Building the strength to get sober while ending old relationships and cutting off old support systems sounds like one of the hardest things you could ask someone to do. Of course, it doesn't always take the first time. People like Cherie should have the time they need to get clean and sober. But a policy of simply creating that time and space can also feel deeply unsatisfying. There are so many people suffering so much from their addictions every day, and the visibility of that problem is heartbreaking and troubling. The harms of addiction feel too urgent to let the circular processes of drug use, sobriety, and relapse play out over and over again on an individual basis indefinitely. But I think it's fair to say that, at the moment, we can't be sure of a better option. Of course, there are also more punitive reasons for not supporting harm reduction. Some people have a truly dehumanizing view of people who use drugs, and believe that prison is a proportionate response to drug use. But since the question of this episode is how we can begin to heal the wounds of our nation's addiction problem, I'm not going to spend much time addressing those perspectives. Mass incarceration was a failure, and its guiding philosophies have little to offer this conversation. So, back to what can be done. It's hard to imagine a successful, structural-level program of harm reduction. But at the same time, its practitioners have unparalleled insight into the problems at hand. Their non-punitive approach means they have a direct line to the needs and motivations of people who use drugs. And since there's so little consensus on how to minimize the scourge of addiction, keeping people alive on an individual basis seems like a good way to spend the time. So this is where our history of meth ends. We followed its trajectory from a commonly prescribed medication to a dangerous street drug. We've heard about how its black market was continuously destroyed and reformed over the last 50 years. How meth became a rural drug and picked up a new social identity, associated with the worst stereotypes about rural people forever after. The history of meth provides more lessons in what not to do than what to do about addiction. But those negative lessons matter too. If we want to shed the baggage of the past and understand the drug problems we're facing today, we have to understand that there are no longer, and maybe never were, any truly urban or rural drugs. The reasons people get high: trauma, boredom, the need to work long and hard, the need for a little excitement, are universal. The resources available to help people who need treatment, on the other hand, are decidedly not universal. Rural people are likely to live far from treatment centers and harm reduction services, and often struggle to meet court requirements in places where public transit is sparse. Available treatments for stimulant addiction lag far behind those for opioid addiction, and there's less funding to provide them. It's hard to separate that resource disparity from 2 decades of media narratives about meth users as tweakers and hillbillies. By limiting our public understanding of meth and meth users, those stereotypes have hurt all Americans, rural and urban. This has been Home Cooked, a 50-year history of meth in America. Home Cooked, a 50-year history of meth in America, is a production of Rural Remix. Original music was composed by Quincy Pomvere and Leo Pozell. This series was written and produced by Olivia Weeks, and edited and produced by Susanna Brown. Assistant producers are Anya Slepian and Bea Portella. Executive producer is Joel Cohen. Thank you to the staff of the Daily Yonder and the Rural Assembly.
You've been listening to Rural Remix. Check out our feed for more podcasts highlighting deeper, richer stories about life in rural places.